Cool. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. I enjoy coming up to Toronto, especially when it's not snowing and freezing cold. The weather is glorious. I enjoy it. It's been not so glorious in Charlotte, a little bit hot. I've been coming to FITC now for a number of years, so I appreciate Sean and his crew for bringing me out, allowing me to share some thoughts with you. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of the culmination of some work that we've been doing at Cardinal over the last 2 or 3 years. I've given a couple of presentations around pattern library concepts, trying to use Sass to make them worthwhile, and then using them to increase collaboration between designers and developers. And today we're going to talk about kind of the next iteration of that concept, which is making them maintainable, because it's gotten kind of wild out there. So out of curiosity, who currently uses some type of pattern library generator, whether it's like hologram or anything similar? Nobody? Oh, okay. Who uses Bootstrap or some type of design system, material design, anything like that? Okay, a few more hands. Do you love it? It's all right. It's like, yeah, okay. That's how I feel too. So I work for these folks, Cardinal Solutions. We're a consultancy in the East Coast of the United States. And we work a lot with clients. And what we've noticed over the past couple of years is there's been this huge drive to create these nice, collaborative, maintainable design systems in the form of a style guide or pattern library, which is kind of cool, right? It's a good way to kind of boil down the designs that we do and think about things in terms of systems as opposed to some poor designer sitting in a cube somewhere, chained to his desk or her desk, and just turning out Photoshop comps for 40 hours a week, weeks on end, and then the poor developers get that and then have to make changes all the time. So we're going to talk about how to make these types of pattern libraries maintainable. And because not many people are using these generative systems, I have some baseline knowledge to just brain dump on you today. So you can follow me online at Bermon Painter. That's also my Gmail and my Skype and whatever else. So if you're ever in Charlotte or you want to just chat about pattern libraries, you can totally give me a ring. I'm almost always online. I don't sleep very often, so you can always find me somewhere. Now, this is kind of what I view a pattern as. The patterns are these repeatable interactions that, when combined together, they create these really robust, complex systems. Now, we work a lot in the enterprise space. Most of the work that we do is fairly large and complex, and there's a lot of nonsense that goes on to get something out the door. Now, we look at something kind of like this, right, where these are just a bunch of mastheads for conference sites. And I compared 4 or 5 of them, including FITC. A lot of these sites follow similar patterns, right? There's a heading or a masthead that has a logo on the left-hand side and some type of horizontal navigation, and that's it. That's the pattern that you see across numerous websites today. Now, the benefits of using something like a pattern library is that it's such a powerful resource that can drive consistent user experience. It can reduce repetitive and sometimes boring design work and development work where you're making changes across a whole bunch of different sites or trying to find and replace a bunch of classes or something crazy. It creates a common design language that you can use between your team. And hopefully it allows your team to focus on solving real problems as opposed to doing this super boring, somewhat meaningless, repetitive work, like having to fix button styles that have kind of grown to have 20 or some odd plus over the last few years that you just don't really do. So if you do a pattern library correctly, they can be a great tool to break down user interface into its most modular parts, rather than thinking about design as a series of pages, which is just kind of boring and old school by now. It also serves as a great resource for new members. So we're always hiring, especially in the front-end space. There are so many folks that are coming into the industry, and there's so many holes that we still need to fill. It's a great tool to kind of onboard new folks on your team, whether they're business people or designers, UX people or developers, just so they can see the overarching system and how all these design patterns come together to make a product or some type of a service. Now, one of the things that it really helps, and I've talked about this in the past, is it really helps improve collaboration. Because we're not just designers or developers working in silos. Hopefully, it's still the norm in some organizations, and that's kind of painful because you don't get to collaborate with other really smart people that you might enjoy working with. But it helps improve collaboration by solidifying an overall design system. Now, even though we're saying design, design includes all of these groups of people that are making this product. So keep in mind that we don't want to get into the standpoint where we're doing design by committee. We try and be super all-inclusive, bring everybody in. The more people you bring in, as a caution, the harder it's going to be to try and control scope and the overall direction of the product, because everybody's a designer. Coding things is kind of a black box sometimes, and anybody outside of that realm don't quite get what's going on, so you can talk about it and they just don't really understand. But design, on the other hand, everybody's a designer, which is kind of painful sometimes. The second benefit is around naming. Naming is just really hard. If we're trying to create these extensible patterns, naming that pattern correctly so it can be used in various contexts is really difficult. So we end up spending a lot of time trying to come up with the correct naming structure that identifies this pattern without pigeonholing ourselves into something where we have to change it later on. So it's useful to try and name these patterns or these modules as a team. What this does is helps create a shared language. So when you're calling something an accordion, for example, as long as the team is referring to that pattern with the same term, then so will the business owners and the product folks and anybody that kind of touches the work that you're doing. So it helps improve communication. Now, if you name things well, your patterns will be more flexible, which is kind of the goal, right? We want to build this robust design system that we can use across any type of product that really comes to mind. But naming takes time. It's just really hard. And I kind of suck at it. It's totally not my forte, but I try. The third thing is that large applications and sites are normally created and revised and iterated over and maintained by multiple people that may come and go from the company over a long period of time, hopefully, unless you're a startup and you're just pivoting over and over again. But in most cases, sustainable businesses keep their products for a while, and the people come on and off those teams. And what that leads to in most cases is fragmentation across the product. We do a lot of work for larger financial institutions in Charlotte. It's like the second banking capital in the U.S., basically, where they have lots of siloed teams doing the exact same thing within the exact same line of products. And it's super inconsistent, and it just makes us pull our hair out because we have folks in all these different teams, and we talk to each other, but they don't talk to each other, which is kind of difficult. So you see this type of fragmentation in these larger companies, and even to a certain degree in smaller companies that are trying to churn out products and features fairly quickly. So as patterns are created, they can be tested, iterated upon, improved as a singular module, as opposed to trying to improve the entire product as a whole. So it helps increase consistency because we're focusing on these singular patterns as opposed to, well, we have buttons here, but across these other 20 pages, we also have buttons, but they're all kind of different because different teams and people have worked on them over the past few years. The fourth benefit is that it frees up the team to focus on what's important, which is hopefully solving, understanding your customers, building empathy, and solving the right problems, as opposed to doing all this boring work, tedious work that we sometimes have to do just to maintain what we're doing. Fifth is once you have a core library of modules, the team can rock and roll pretty quick. They can think about the problems, prototype those out using existing patterns, get those in front of customers, and iterate and iterate and iterate to improve little by little. And it's fantastic. So it increases the speed of the team a whole bunch. And then having a core set of patterns or modules collected in a single location so that anybody can look at them, whether it's a designer, a UX person, developer, whomever, makes it a whole lot easier to maintain things because you're changing things ideally or theoretically in one location, and then you're reapplying those modules in other places or other applications. Now, the reason that it improves maintainability is that we know that the singular pattern is hopefully responsive, that they have unit tests or testing in general around functionality. We know that they're accessible, and we know that the group can contribute to these patterns as a whole. So we're tracking the changes on an individual pattern. So it's easier to maintain one thing than 50 things stuck somewhere sporadically throughout a large application. So here's some issues that I kind of see. We've talked about this in the past. And this is where I think most people kind of sit these days, where they're either using static style guides for one. So they're building these on their own without using a system. And it's not bad. It's a good place to start. But they're built with, in my case, I use Middleman a lot. Anybody use Middleman? A couple of folks. I love Middleman. It's so good. I've used that numerous times in the past to build custom pattern libraries because it's easy to use partials and kind of separate things out into individual components and then churn out static HTML and give that off to a client. Then I can just kind of go away into the sunset and twirl my mustache with a smirk on my face. But these types of static style guides are basically standalone representations of the modules that exist within your design system. But they don't really link directly to the application or product that you're developing. Now, there are a handful of great examples out there. I think every large enterprise or company are trying to build their own design system and shove that out to the public so that we can use en masse. Now, the challenge, I think, with these types of static style guides is that as you change your modules, you have to change them in the pattern library or in the style guide, and then you also have to find where you use those in applications and manually change them as well. So if your HTML structure changes or your classes change, or you get a wild hair and you're changing everything to BIM, you have to change all of your structure and your CSS. The CSS isn't a big deal, but the HTML structure is things that kind of dicey. So, say for example you have your pattern library or your style guide, and you have a pattern, and then you're using that in 5 applications. If you change that in any one of the applications or in your pattern library, you have to change it 6 times, which is a lot of overhead to try and maintain that work. Now, what this does is it leads to a difficult challenge with the team, with the folks that are paying you to do work and be productive, in that you have to keep up to date everywhere you're using that pattern. And the problem is, as soon as you stop updating or something gets behind, whether it's an application or your style guide, it's obsolete. You've done all this work for nothing. You either have to work a lot to catch up, or you have to throw it away because you'll quickly deviate from those patterns. But all that said, it's a really good starting point, right? If you're trying to just kind of edge in to this type of process, it's not horrible. There are some challenges, but that's basically it. But again, there's a lot of great examples out there that I just kind of steal from time to time because they're great. They're doing really great work. Now, the second type, which I think has been growing over the past couple of years, is this concept of a living style guide. Gina Bolton's talked about this a few times, Nicole Sullivan as well. They've been using things like Hologram, which is my personal favorite for a generator. Now, what they are is you write your CSS, right? And the CSS is great. Within your CSS, you document your code, which you should be doing, right? So, 6 months from now or future, you can look back in time and go, oh, I know what I was talking about. Thanks, pass me. That's great. So what you do is you're adding in your components, adding your documentation, and describing why you use a pattern and when you should use it, and then you're putting in a static HTML example. And what these generators will do is they'll read through your CSS, look at the comments that you've put in to document your code, and then it'll spit out static pages in accordance to what you've put in your CSS comments. And it spits out or generates a style guide for you, which is pretty good, right? It saves some time. You don't have all this manual setup. Most of them are as easy as installing a Ruby gem or a Node module to just kind of get them up and running. Now, they're pretty awesome. Again, this is Hologram. I like it. It's easy. It does exactly what I need it to do. And there's just a whole host of options that you can choose from, whether you're working in Node or PHP or Ruby. There's one for every type of language, even .NET, if you're using .NET. Now, even these types of living style guides have their own issues revolving around maintainability. because, again, we have our HTML in one location, but then we have to copy and paste that HTML in any other application or project that we're working on. So we run into those same updating problems where if we update the style guide, we have to update it in every application. Or we risk the things becoming too distant and becoming obsolete, which makes us so sad. Okay, so there's Hologram, there's SC5, which is kind of a Node and Angular-based one. There's KISS, which came from GitHub or Colneath. It's been around the longest, I think, at least the ones that I've used. It's still pretty good, but they all basically do the same type of thing. They parse through your CSS and spit out pages for you, which is a good way to automate it. So that's kind of the time saving. Now, here are the challenges. Because we're a consultancy, we work with so many different clients, and we're doing style guides for all these different clients, or pattern libraries for all these different clients. And I was working for a client, and we spent 6 months, well, I spent 6 months, doing a pattern library and trying to integrate in with their developers, which was cool. Like they kind of caught the gist of what we were trying to do, got on board, and we were turning out all this really good work. We ended up building about 30 or 40 custom modules for them, and then integrating with Telerik, I guess Telerik, which is now Kendo-ish type stuff, to give them a core set of components that they could use to draft and prototype out pages that we could test, and then apply those to the production level code. And it was great, right? It was a really good 6 months. I was just having a lot of fun designing and coding and doing what I enjoy, sipping my root beer and eating my cupcakes. But what nobody really ever talks about, especially in these types of talks, is what to do after you have a pattern library. Because there are a lot of challenges after that. Getting it up and running is kind of the easy part. It just takes time. But maintaining it and keeping it up to date is the huge challenge. Now, nobody talks about how to get buy-in from the execs or from the team because it takes time and money to maintain. Nobody talks about what happens if you're using this pattern library in one or more application. How do you maintain that across everything? And it was a huge challenge because it ended up creating a good bit of technical debt because they're using our patterns and copying and pasting those into their code base. It was a .NET stack, so they were turning those into .NET controls. And they were using those across 4 or 5 different applications inside this larger monolithic application. So there was a lot of rework. So every time we updated a pattern or we found a bug, we had to propagate that in the controller and then apply that to the other 4 or 5 applications. And it quickly became kind of hard to maintain. Now, I'm a consultant, and I was kind of their only front-end person. And it was a 60-person dev team, right? It wasn't a small team, but it was a bunch of .NET folks, which are glorious and lovely people. But there were no designers, and there were no front-end folks. So when I left, can you guess what happened? It totally fell apart, right? Because there was nobody that was taking ownership of the pattern library, and it's still up and online and live, but now they're using it as just a visual guideline on how things should look, which is like 6 months of work and a good chunk of change that's just like sitting there, not being utilized to its fullest potential, which makes me kind of sad. So there are a handful of challenges that happen after you get the pattern library up and running. That I'm going to touch on briefly. I'm not going to get into too much detail because this is going to be a completely separate conference talk, right? There's so much that happens after that is important for you to understand and for your teams to understand. That the biggest challenge that we faced up front was adoption, and that is ultimately why it failed for this one client. The exec, the C-level exec that was a CTO, like, yeah, totally do that. Like, you'll do it, and it'll be great. And it was great until I wasn't there, and then it wasn't great. But I've sat and had discussions with dev managers and design managers and C-level folks about the importance of boiling down the systems that they create. And the challenge that I've noticed is unless they buy in, right? Unless they're totally gung-ho about staffing this with people to maintain it, it will fail every single time. Because unless the developers on the team are super passionate about doing front end and building patterns, they're not going to maintain it, let's be honest. because that's not their focus. That's not what they enjoy doing. So the bottom line is, if those people that are pulling the strings and paying the bills, if they don't see value in what you're doing and understand and comprehend the importance of the work, then they're not going to support it. They're not going to commit time and resources and money to make sure that it stays up and running. So it's never going to happen, right? Never, ever, unless they get buy-in. And that's the hardest point, right? C-level folks have a lot of ego, and they may never change their mind, and it may never be successful. And that's a really tough discussion to have, because you want to do this really great work, and it may just not happen. The second challenge is like an enterprise dirty word, which is governance. Nobody talks about governance, and it's super important. And it's also super boring, but super useful. So governance is this thing that people think should happen, that somebody should do, but nobody ever really does. Now, what happens on these smaller teams, or even larger teams, is you can't do these things loosely. You have to have clearly defined roles and responsibilities and authority. They're important because they enforce accountability on who's responsible for what and what people should be doing. Now, in a nutshell, along with your pattern library, there should be some type of governance framework around the pattern library and around how those patterns in the framework are specified. You can't just have a bunch of developers tossing in patterns at whim. I mean, you can. It's just not very good. But somebody has to have the authority to make the decisions on what comes in and what goes out and what takes priority. What the governance framework should not do is it should never specify the approach on what goes on in production. That's whether you're choosing waterfall or agile or Kanban or whatever, who's doing information architecture and how you're doing it. It shouldn't define these tactile types of things that we do on a daily basis, but it should define the strategic stuff on what's coming in, what's going out, and who's responsible. Now, I would say that a governance process focuses on three areas. This is probably super boring, but it's useful, because it's governance. So, three things. Strategy, basically who defines or determines the overall strategy for the pattern library. Two is the policy, who determines what the team must and must not do. And then three, the standards, who decides the overall nature of the pattern library. Now again, I was working on another client, and it was a corporate real estate company that had lots and lots of money doing really good work. They decided that they wanted to build, I think, 8 or so companies over the course of a year, technology companies relating to corporate real estate, which is kind of cool. So we got to come in greenfield on a handful of products, build them from the ground up. About 6 months in, that they realized that, about 6 months in when we came on, they realized that they're basically reinventing the wheel from a front-end architecture and back-end perspective on every single application. So they determined that they wanted to build a pattern library that they could use globally, which is an awesome idea, right? If you're a startup and you're trying to build this type of stuff, that is totally useful because it saves you a lot of time, makes things consistent, and affects the overall user experience. Now, the challenge is that there was no governance on who should do what and what should come in the system. So they're a Ruby on Rails shop using Angular for the front end. Anybody ever done that before? Rails with Angular front end? Don't. It's super painful. So painful. But they did that, and it's working, right? It's working pretty well. But their dependencies is absolutely insane because developers are working on smaller portions of the site, and they're adding in new frameworks and other things. When they converted to Angular, for example, they were rendering it 3 times because they used, somebody manually put it in, and somebody used the gem, and then somebody else used a front-end dependency thing to bring that stuff in, which is crazy. So overall, on their largest product, they had 300+ gem dependencies for this application, which is insane. It's just so much going on, and it made it super brittle. And it comes about because there's no governance. So that's all I'll say about governance. If you want to talk more about it, let me know. I enjoy it because it's useful. The third challenge is the application. So taking what you've done and the governance and applying that to something real. So getting the team on board is mostly easy, but growing and maintaining the pattern library is where it gets hard really fast. Because, as soon as a pattern library deviates from what's actually happening in production, which happens all the time, the work that you're doing is obsolete. You either have to catch up or you have to throw it away. The last challenge, and we've talked about this, is duplication of HTML. This is kind of the crux of the problem, where most of the maintainability issues come in, where we're defining these patterns, this front-end architecture, and we're having to use that over and over again, in some cases copy and pasting from one application to another, from our pattern library to the application code. So the challenge arises is that the code that we're documenting in our pattern library doesn't exist in the applications that we're using. So let's talk about modularizing things and creating these patterns. So to work really, really well, a successful pattern library should focus on the HTML, right? The modules that you're creating that you need to implement within your applications. They should be created in a way where those patterns are the single source of truth, that you're able to use those patterns anywhere you want without having to copy and paste. That's the ultimate goal. So I should be able to do that without copying and pasting. That's what I want to do. And that's the problem that we're trying to tackle on my team. So a module in my mind consists of the visual design, the code that kind of backs that up, and renders an example of the module. So if I'm taking this singular pattern and kind of looping it together, this is what I should see. I should see my HTML, or my template for the pattern. I should see my CSS, what makes it look like it's supposed to look. Then I should have my JavaScript, if there is JavaScript, and the JavaScript should define how it functions, which is like pretty simple, right? It's a pretty easy concept. Now, along with the JavaScript, I should have unit tests somewhere so that module is independently testable. And then, like, good things that we should be doing in every module is every module should be responsive, right? Because we should be able to put it anywhere in any application, and it should respond accordingly based off of where we put it. It should be accessible. Accessibility is important, right? We should always make what we create accessible. Not everybody has perfect vision or can use a computer very well. They need some type of assistance. So everything always should be accessible. 3, it needs to be versioned. Version is equally important because if I change a pattern here in my pattern library, I don't want that automatically cascading to every application I've used it in. That could be bad news very quick. So it needs to be versioned. And then the 4th, that pattern should be able to manage its own dependencies. I should be able to find those in the pattern and not really worry about it too much. I shouldn't worry about it conflicting with other things. It should be namespaced appropriately and manage its own dependencies. So that's, in Bermon's mind, that's what a module should be. That's how I define what those are. So I should be able to take this single source of truth, those singular patterns, and I should be able to call those and put them in my pattern library. I should also be able to call that exact same pattern, again, single source of truth, and use that in an application. I should also be able to take that single pattern and use that across any number of applications that I want. So again, I have this single source of truth that houses all of my patterns and all the stuff that makes that pattern a pattern, and I should be able to use that in a pattern library and then any number of applications that I feel like using it in. Okay, so again, what we're creating is a single source of truth. This is basically an API, right? We're basically creating a pattern API, which I think is amazing. That's such an awesome idea. I didn't think of it, for sure. The challenge is these modules is that, or the challenge that we're running into as a team is we're trying to build an API system that's agnostic for the most part, that we could use in Rails or PHP or in an Angular app or React app or whatever. And that's a nut we're trying to crack. We're not quite there yet. So that's our big challenge right now, is to make sure that we can use this API across anything and make it super useful. Now, the API itself is decoupled from our data, or our data API that has the actual content and things that are living in a database somewhere. So to make this work, to make it truly work, the applications that we build need to be built in a modular way. So we can isolate parts of the interface, across any application, reuse this wherever you want, and also use these in our pattern library. So if I was to diagram that out at a very high level, this is kind of what I would see. So I have my pattern library that kind of lives on its own. It's just there as a visual representation, or as the API. So it houses all of my patterns and all of the unit tests and everything that makes those patterns patterns. And then I can use that pattern API, call that from my pattern library, and basically just call every single pattern that I have, and it'll give me everything that I need. Then within the application, I should be able to call just the patterns that I need, right? I don't want everything. We don't want it to turn into Bootstrap where all I really need is a grid system, but I get 40 other components that I'm never ever going to use. So I should be able to call just the pattern that I want within my application, and then the application has a separate API that it calls that houses the data to make everything work. And what this really creates for us is, if we're focusing on our application, it really just contains the business logic to make the application work, and then I'm pulling in patterns and data and making something that I can rock and roll on pretty quick. That's the ultimate goal. And that's really where this pattern API concept becomes super useful, because we can break down all of these UI pieces into their own module, build this nice, robust design system that can live on its own or live in any number of applications and a pattern library. And then when it comes to building an actual product, we can focus on what needs to be built, instead of, well, my buttons are inconsistent. Do we want a big button or a large button or a small button or whatever? We want to keep a single version of that module accessible via an API that can accept parameters, including data. So once we're just using the API, this is where I think the magic happens in my mind, and we have proof of concepts that's kind of working, but it needs a lot of TLC. It's a lot of work. Is that the applications just now contain our business logic, which is fantastic. So this makes it relatively quick to create a new app, spin up new pages, do a new task flow, test that, iterate and improve, and make things better without having to write a whole bunch of code to make that happen. Now, the biggest benefit, right, that tackles the maintenance problems that we've had in our static style guides and our living style guides, is that we can now update our patterns in one location and then choose, because it's versioned, when those updates should cascade to specific applications. So we can update version numbers per pattern, per application, and everything just kind of magically updates, right? It's great. Yeah, I like that. So here's a concept of what we're trying to work with. This is a navigation module, horizontal navigation. So we're passing in a couple things, or a few things actually. One is the first call that you see, or the first section that you see there, is it's hitting our pattern library, and we're pulling our horizontal navigation pattern, right? Which is what we saw earlier with all of our conference sites, which is just a list of links displayed in a horizontal fashion. The second one that you see is the call to the data that should live in our data API for the application. So I can call that API, and then I should be able to pass in a few other parameters that actually generate the content for the link. So for the sake of argument, let's say that within our API we have a list of our navigation items. Within that we have the label, and we have the link that it's supposed to go to. So within our module, we can pass those attributes back to the pattern itself and generate the list of links with the appropriate label and link that it's supposed to go to. And what that would spit out in theory was something kind of like this. So it gives us the HTML that we need with the appropriate JavaScript hooks, so our JavaScript fires correctly, with any other classes and odds and ends that makes this look like it's supposed to look. So that's how patterns ideally would work, right? So within any given page, we can call any number of patterns, also call the data, pass those into our patterns, and generate what we need to generate. And this comes to creating pages. So pages are the things that we generate that we serve to the client, that they can actually interact with. And the way that I kind of divide this up, within the application. This is like basic application structure using the API, or both APIs, data and patterns. The first are the elements. So I normally just take a version of normalize, and I use something kind of like that for every single application that I use, just to normalize how things should look specific to that application. So I make changes to normalize. The second thing are modules. So we've talked about modules a lot. So I normalize things. I'm pulling in my modules that I need to build the application. And then 3, I have a theme, right? We can't just style things one way. I guess we could, but we're going to try not to. In our pattern library, we're actually separating our CSS into 2 sections. We have things that define our structure, how things should lay out, and then we have CSS that defines how it should look in its given context. So we have the themable version of our patterns that we layer on specific to this application, and then we have our layout. So the layout would be the templates or the pages that we're creating that's combining our elements and our modules and the data coming from the API and the theme, and then we spit out a page. Now, what we don't want to do is we don't want to generate these pages on the client side and then put all the work there. We want to generate these pages behind the scenes on the server, cache the pages, and then serve those to the client. So the page is the generated output that you would actually access and interact with. And that, I think, is a challenge. So there's still a long way to go on making this really effective. There's only a couple of companies that I've noticed even trying to do this type of work. One is Lonely Planet, doing some really great work on the Rails side. They have a pattern library up, doing similar concepts to this, and they've open sourced it on GitHub, which is pretty amazing. So if Ruby's your thing, or Rails is your thing, they have some pretty good examples on how to build that. Again, they're called Lonely Planet. So to wrap everything up, what we're trying to focus on and what we're trying to solve is, one, we're trying to fix the maintainability issues that exist when we're creating applications. Static style guides, living style guides are a good start, right? If that's where you need to start there. There's nothing horribly wrong with that. Just understand that there are maintenance issues if you're trying to use that across more than one application. It's not too bad if you just have the pattern library and your app. It's not horrible. You can totally manage that without too much work. Second thing is that modules need to be self-sustaining, right? That they should live on their own. That includes HTML, CSS, JavaScript, unit tests. They should be responsive, accessible, and just overall glorious by themselves. And the end focus to this is to give us the framework so that we can focus on, again, understanding our customers, gaining empathy into what they need, and then solving the correct problems. So that's all I have. I think I have maybe like 5 minutes for questions for folks that want to chat. What are your thoughts? Yeah. So her question was, any advice on how to choose what's going into the pattern library, right, or the style guide? Okay, good. So when we're doing client stuff, what we try and avoid doing is like doing all the patterns at once and then building pages. As we're going through discovery with the clients and trying to figure out what we're trying to build, we'll take it a page at a time, and then on that page identify the patterns that we need. We'll create those patterns first so we can get started. Once we have the patterns defined and in the style guide, it may be 5 or 10 patterns maybe, then we actually build the page. So that's the easiest way that I found to do it, so you're not biting off a whole bunch of work, because it takes probably a good 6 months if it's just one person to get a really solid, robust pattern library up and running.
Where do you start with programming and coding your pattern library?
The library or the API?
The library.
The library itself? So like what type of languages do we use?
Yeah, or where would you start? Would you go to Hologram or some other things that you mentioned, or just a raw HTML, CSS page?
Yeah, so his question is, if I was doing it from scratch, I think, where would I start building a pattern library? I wouldn't try and build an API out of the gate if you've never done it before. I guess you could. But you learn a lot by using pre-built systems, especially things like hologram. So if I was doing it from scratch and it was new to the team, I would try a generator as opposed to trying to do everything by hand, because it'll save you a lot of time. You have a lot of churn if you're doing everything from scratch. So it's more efficient to use a generator and then learn as a team from there, and then decide if you want to create an API or not.
One of your examples, it starts to kind of look very WordPressy, like you have like element, class, and then probably you can add more classes to that element as well. So how do you sort of stop avoiding that kind of scope or creep or classification creep that no one
Yeah, so his comment was that it's looking very WordPressy, right? Where we have all these different WordPress, I'm a Drupal guy, so we call them modules. I'm not sure what they call them WordPress. But you have all these pieces of code that you can use in WordPress to generate pages. How do you avoid, I guess, that type of scope creep or complexity? It's hard. It's really hard. I think one benefit is that you're controlling the HTML and the CSS yourself as a team. And if you initiate some type of governance process that's really determining how those modules are being created, the type of classes that you're using, and being really careful on any third-party dependencies that you're bringing in. That's one way to control it, but again, it's really hard. It has to be a really focused, concerted effort between all the players involved to make that work.
sort of a follow-up question. When you're doing all the meta tagging for
Mm-hmm.
all the modules and so on, the governance model actually dictates that, or is that just something that developers can actually say, like, you're going to have to like this.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's something that I would say wouldn't go into governance, right? If it's too much overhead and probably not the right person to be making those decisions, then you end up like a bank where nothing gets done. Governance determines how things get into the process, but the actual rubber meets the road types of decisions happen within the dev team outside of governance. So governance would be more like, we want to build this module. Does one currently exist? If it does, can this change to match the current pattern, or do we need a new pattern? That's where the governance kind of comes into place. We're not just building, 5 patterns that have, 5% deviation in what they actually do. My favorite root beer. Oh yeah. So there's a salted Calmer root beer that comes from the Northwest that is absolutely amazing. It makes the best root beer floats. Only one place sells it, and I can only buy it on Amazon. But the shipping costs more than the root beer, so it's like a real treat whenever I buy that for myself. Anything else? Yeah.
When you're doing this kind of approach, creating the patterns and then putting the pages together at the end, when you're working with an actual client, client wants to see pages instead of seeing the patterns. They want to see the end result. How would you tackle that? Do you do the patterns first and then do the pages at the end, or do you focus on a page and then do all these patterns and get to those pages? Like, how would you manage that?
So her question is, clients, this is my thought. Clients aren't very patient. But her question is that clients are looking for output, right? They want to see pages and real work. So how do you approach that with the clients? Do you do all the patterns first and then do pages? Do you do pages first and then the patterns? And there's some ebb and flow that goes on, and we have a couple different things that are happening in tandem. So one kind of falls within the realm of our designers and our UX people that are having discussions with clients. So some of that has to do with training the client and being really upfront that you may not see something for 2 or 3 weeks because we have some groundwork to lay first. Then you'll start to see things more quickly. Most clients are okay with that. Some are still kind of dicey. In that case, our designers are doing whiteboarding sessions to help them understand the structure of the page and what should take priority, what patterns we need to create. And as they're finalizing those patterns, the front-end folks are developing those out. So there's kind of like this cascade of work going on where UX and design are figuring out what's going on, and then as they finish patterns, they give those to developers, And then as we get enough patterns to build a page, then they're building a full page. And then the client starts to see a bunch of real work once we get a good core of 10 or 15 patterns set up. I have no minutes. I'll be here till like Friday afternoon, so we can totally chat. We can go find root beer. There are a couple spots in Toronto that do it. Thanks, everybody.